The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Copper Creek as Marshal Jake Thompson rode through the main street. His weathered face showed the lines of a man who had seen too much violence in his 35 years. The town buzzed with unusual activity for a Tuesday morning. Groups of men huddled together, whispering in urgent tones while casting nervous glances toward the jail. Jake dismounted near the saloon where his old friend Sam Miller waited with grave news. Sam's normally cheerful face was etched with worry as he approached the marshal. The two Apache girls, barely 16 years old, sat behind bars awaiting execution scheduled for dawn. The townspeople believed they had poisoned the water supply that killed 3 settlers last week. However, Jake sensed something was terribly wrong with the entire situation. The evidence seemed too convenient, too perfectly arranged. The girls had been found near the contaminated well with suspicious powder in their possession. Yet their eyes held no guilt, only fear and confusion. They spoke no English, making their defense impossible in the white man's court. Dr. Harrison, the town's physician, had examined the victims and declared the deaths were from poisoning. His testimony sealed the girls' fate. Judge Wilson, a harsh man known for his quick verdicts, had sentenced them without hesitation. The execution would serve as a warning to other Apache who might consider attacking the growing settlement. Jake studied the case documents in his small office as evening approached. Something nagged at his experienced lawman's instincts. The powder found on the girls was identified as arsenic, but Jake knew the Apache used different methods for warfare. They were skilled with natural poisons from desert plants, not store-bought chemicals that could only be purchased from the general store. The marshal decided to visit the girls in their cell. Through broken Spanish and hand gestures, he learned they had been gathering medicinal herbs for their sick grandmother. When white men approached them, the strangers had forced strange powder into their hands before disappearing into the desert. The girls had been too frightened to throw it away, unsure of its purpose. As Jake left the jail, he noticed several prominent townsmen meeting secretly behind the bank. Their hushed conversations stopped abruptly when they spotted him. Among them stood businessman Edgar Whitman, who owned most of the valuable land around Copper Creek. Whitman's cold stare followed Jake as he walked toward his horse. The marshal's suspicions deepened when he remembered recent events. Whitman had been pushing hard to expand his cattle operations into Apache territory. The businessman had repeatedly complained to the territorial governor about the native presence blocking his plans for prosperity. These deaths provided the perfect excuse to justify military action against the peaceful Apache band. Jake spent the sleepless night reviewing every detail of the case. The contaminated well sat directly on land that Whitman coveted for his newest ranch project. The timing of the poisoning coincided perfectly with crucial territorial meetings about land rights. The evidence against the girls appeared almost too obvious, as if someone wanted them caught and blamed. Dawn was approaching rapidly, and Jake knew he had precious little time to uncover the truth. The townspeople were already gathering for the execution, their faces showing a mixture of fear and bloodthirsty anticipation. Some called for immediate hanging, while others demanded the girls be burned as witches. The mob mentality was building to a dangerous crescendo. Jake made a crucial decision that would define his career and conscience. He would delay the execution and investigate further, even if it meant challenging the most powerful men in Copper Creek. The Apache girls deserved justice, not convenient scapegoating for someone else's crimes. The marshal strapped on his guns and prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him. The first rays of sunlight painted the desert landscape in brilliant orange as Jake walked toward the jail. His boots echoed on the wooden sidewalk while angry voices grew louder near the gallows. Time was running out, and Jake knew that saving 2 innocent lives might cost him everything he had worked to build in this harsh frontier town. The angry crowd had already assembled around the hastily constructed gallows when Jake Thompson stepped out of his office. Men clutched rifles while women held their children close, all demanding swift justice for the supposed poisoners. The air crackled with tension as Jake approached the mob, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Judge Wilson stood on the courthouse steps, his black robes flapping in the morning breeze. His weathered face showed no mercy as he prepared to read the death warrant. Behind him, Edgar Whitman and his associates watched with barely concealed satisfaction. They had orchestrated this moment perfectly, using fear and prejudice to achieve their goals. Jake stepped forward and raised his voice above the crowd's angry murmur. He announced his intention to delay the execution pending further investigation. The crowd erupted in furious protests, with several men shouting that the marshal was protecting savage killers. Judge Wilson's face turned red with rage as he demanded an explanation for this unprecedented interference. The marshal explained his concerns about the evidence, pointing out inconsistencies that demanded closer examination. Dr. Harrison pushed through the crowd, insisting his medical findings were beyond question. The physician's defensive tone only strengthened Jake's suspicions about the entire conspiracy. Something was definitely wrong with the official story. Edgar Whitman stepped forward, his voice dripping with false concern for community safety. He reminded everyone that Apache raids had been increasing, and swift justice would send a clear message to other potential attackers. His words inflamed the crowd further, with several men demanding immediate action regardless of legal procedures. Jake knew he needed concrete evidence to save the girls' lives. He sent his deputy to examine the contaminated well, while he investigated the general store's arsenic sales records. The storekeeper, nervous and sweating, claimed his records had been accidentally destroyed in a recent cleaning. The convenient disappearance of evidence only confirmed Jake's growing suspicions. Meanwhile, the Apache girls sat in their cell, unaware that their fate hung in the balance of political maneuvering. Their quiet dignity impressed Jake as he brought them water and food. Through gestures, they continued to maintain their innocence, pointing toward the desert where the mysterious white men had appeared and disappeared. Dr. Harrison approached Jake privately, suggesting the marshal was making a dangerous mistake. The physician warned that protecting Apache killers would destroy Jake's reputation and career. His words carried an underlying threat that Jake recognized from years of dealing with corruption. The doctor was clearly part of the conspiracy. As afternoon approached, Jake's deputy returned with disturbing news from the well examination. The arsenic contamination appeared to be recent and concentrated in a specific area. More importantly, boot prints around the well matched expensive Eastern-made shoes, not the soft moccasins worn by Apache women. The evidence was building against the real perpetrators. Jake decided to confront Edgar Whitman directly at his office above the bank. The businessman's confident demeanor faltered slightly when Jake presented his preliminary findings. Whitman insisted the marshal was grasping at straws and warned that protecting murderers would have serious consequences for Jake's future in law enforcement. The conversation revealed Whitman's true character as a ruthless opportunist willing to sacrifice innocent lives for profit. He spoke about manifest destiny and the need to clear obstacles for progress and civilization. His words disgusted Jake, who recognized the hollow justifications used by men who put greed above human decency. Evening brought new developments, as Jake discovered that Whitman had been secretly meeting with territorial officials about acquiring Apache lands. The businessman had painted the local Apache as dangerous threats requiring military intervention. The poisoning provided perfect justification for the land seizure he desperately wanted. Jake spent the night gathering more evidence, following tracks and interviewing reluctant witnesses. Several townspeople had seen strange men near the well on the night of the poisoning, but fear kept them silent. The marshal realized he was fighting not just corruption, but a web of intimidation that reached throughout the community. As dawn approached for the second time, Jake prepared for the most dangerous confrontation of his career. He had enough evidence to expose the conspiracy, but challenging powerful men meant risking everything. The Apache girls' lives depended on his courage to stand against corruption and prejudice that threatened to destroy justice in Copper Creek. The second dawn brought even larger crowds to Copper Creek's main street. Word had spread to neighboring settlements about the delayed execution, and angry ranchers rode in demanding immediate justice. Jake Thompson stood alone against mounting pressure as Judge Wilson threatened to remove him from office for obstructing legal proceedings. Edgar Whitman had spent the night rallying support among the town's influential citizens. He painted Jake as a traitor who valued Apache lives over white settlers' safety. The businessman's persuasive arguments swayed many neutral townspeople who began questioning their marshal's loyalty and judgment. Jake knew he needed irrefutable proof to save the girls and expose the conspiracy. He rode out to the contaminated well with his deputy, carefully examining every inch of ground around the water source. Hidden beneath a large rock, they discovered a small glass vial that still contained traces of arsenic. The container bore the distinctive marking of an Eastern chemical company. The marshal's investigation led him to the local trading post, where the elderly owner reluctantly admitted seeing strange men purchasing supplies 3 days before the poisoning. Under pressure, he described 2 well-dressed strangers who paid in gold coins and asked specific questions about the Apache camping areas. Their description matched hired gunmen known to work for wealthy businessmen. Dr. Harrison became increasingly nervous as Jake's investigation progressed. The physician began avoiding the marshal and refused to discuss his medical findings further. His defensive behavior convinced Jake that the doctor was either being paid or threatened to support the false narrative about the girls. Guilt, Jake decided to visit the Apache camp to gather more information about the girls' story. The journey required careful navigation through hostile territory, as tensions between whites and Apaches had reached dangerous levels. The tribal elders initially viewed Jake with suspicion, but his respectful approach and genuine concern for the girls gradually earned their trust. Through an elderly Apache who spoke broken English, Jake learned that the 2 girls were known for their gentle nature and healing knowledge. They often collected medicinal plants to help sick tribal members and had never shown any interest in violence against whites. Their grandmother confirmed they had left camp to gather herbs for her fever treatment. The tribal medicine man examined the mysterious powder forced upon the girls by the white strangers. His experienced nose detected the harsh chemical smell of store-bought poison, completely different from any natural substances used by his people. This expert testimony provided crucial evidence of the girls' innocence. Jake's return to town revealed that Whitman had not been idle during his absence. The businessman had convinced several prominent citizens to sign a petition demanding Jake's immediate removal from office. They accused him of endangering the community by protecting savage killers and delaying rightful justice. The marshal confronted Judge Wilson in his chambers, presenting all the evidence he had gathered. The judge listened with growing discomfort as Jake methodically destroyed the case against the Apache girls. However, Wilson surprised Jake by revealing his own involvement in Whitman's land acquisition scheme. The judge had been promised a substantial payment for ensuring the girls' execution proceeded smoothly. This revelation exposed the corruption's true depth, and Jake realized he faced not just prejudice but organized criminal conspiracy. Whitman had purchased the cooperation of key officials to manufacture a crisis that would justify military action against the Apache. The girls were merely convenient scapegoats in a larger scheme of greed and deception. As evening approached, Jake received an ultimatum from the town council. Execute the girls immediately or face removal from office and possible criminal charges for aiding enemies of the state. The marshal was given until midnight to make his decision, while armed guards ensured the girls could not escape their cells. Jake spent the dark hours preparing for what might be his final stand as a lawman. He cleaned his guns and wrote detailed reports documenting the conspiracy he had uncovered. If he died defending the innocent girls, at least the truth would survive to expose the corruption that threatened to destroy justice in the territory. The marshal's lonely vigil was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Sam Miller arrived with news that several honest townspeople were beginning to question the official story. Jake's investigation had planted seeds of doubt that were slowly growing despite Whitman's propaganda efforts. The tide might be turning, but time was running out for the condemned girls. Midnight struck with ominous finality as Jake Thompson faced the most crucial decision of his life. The town council's ultimatum echoed in his mind, while he stood guard outside the jail where 2 innocent Apache girls awaited their fate. Armed men loyal to Edgar Whitman patrolled the streets, ready to enforce the businessman's will through violence if necessary. Jake's deputy approached with disturbing news that changed everything. A dying man had stumbled into town claiming to be one of the hired gunmen who poisoned the well. Shot by his own partners to eliminate witnesses, he gasped out a confession that implicated Whitman and his associates in the murderous conspiracy. The revelation provided the missing link Jake needed to expose the truth. The wounded man, barely clinging to life, revealed the shocking details of Whitman's plan. The businessman had hired 3 professional killers to contaminate the well and frame the Apache girls. The strategy would create public outrage against all Apaches, justifying military intervention and land seizure. The girls were chosen specifically because their deaths would inflame racial hatred. Dr. Harrison arrived to treat the wounded gunman, but his medical assistance came with suspicious reluctance. Jake noticed the physician's nervous behavior and forced him to reveal his role in the conspiracy. Under pressure, Harrison admitted to falsifying the autopsy, reports to hide evidence that the victims had been poisoned with a specific type of arsenic unavailable to Apaches. The confession created a domino effect as other conspirators began to panic. Judge Wilson attempted to flee town under cover of darkness, but Jake's deputy intercepted him at the outskirts. The judge's saddlebags contained gold coins and documents proving his participation in Whitman's land acquisition scheme. The evidence trail was becoming impossible to ignore. Jake realized he needed to act quickly before Whitman eliminated more witnesses. The businessman had demonstrated his willingness to kill anyone who threatened his plans, including his own hired accomplices. The marshal gathered his remaining allies and prepared for a confrontation that would determine whether justice or corruption would prevail. In Copper Creek, the wounded gunman's condition deteriorated rapidly, but he managed to reveal the location where his partners had hidden additional evidence. Jake sent trusted men to retrieve documents and poison samples that would prove Whitman's guilt beyond any doubt. The race against time intensified as dawn approached with its promise of execution. Edgar Whitman sensed the changing tide and decided to accelerate his timeline. He gathered his supporters and demanded immediate action against the Apache girls, claiming that delays only encouraged more Indian attacks. His desperate urgency revealed a man who knew his conspiracy was unraveling and needed to eliminate evidence quickly. The confrontation erupted when Jake announced his intention to release the girls based on new evidence. Whitman's armed supporters surrounded the jail, creating a tense standoff that could explode into violence at any moment. The businessman demanded that Jake surrender his badge and allow justice to proceed according to the court's verdict. Jake stood firm, despite being outnumbered by Whitman's gunmen. He presented the dying man's confession and the forged medical evidence to the assembled crowd. Many townspeople began to realize they had been manipulated by lies and propaganda designed to serve one man's greed. The atmosphere shifted as doubt replaced certainty. The Apache girls watched through their cell window as their fate hung in the balance of a growing confrontation. Their quiet dignity in the face of death impressed even some of their former accusers. Jake's passionate defense of their innocence began to sway public opinion against the execution. Whitman made a desperate attempt to salvage his plan by claiming the new evidence was fabricated by Indian sympathizers. He accused Jake of accepting Apache bribes and betraying his own people for personal gain. The businessman's wild accusations only highlighted his desperation and damaged his credibility further. The standoff continued through the early morning hours as both sides gathered reinforcements. Jake's supporters included several respected citizens who valued justice over profit. Whitman's faction consisted mainly of hired guns and opportunists who stood to benefit from the land seizure. The battle lines were clearly drawn between corruption and righteousness. As the sun rose over Copper Creek, Jake prepared for what might be his final stand as a lawman. The evidence of conspiracy was overwhelming, but armed force threatened to override legal justice. The marshal checked his weapons and steeled himself for a confrontation that would determine whether two innocent girls lived or died for another man's greed. The morning sun cast long shadows across Copper Creek's dusty main street as two opposing forces faced each other in deadly silence. Jake Thompson stood with his small group of allies outside the jail, while Edgar Whitman's hired gunmen formed a threatening semicircle around the building. The tension could be cut with a knife as both sides prepared for what seemed like inevitable violence. Jake made one final attempt at peaceful resolution by addressing the gathered crowd directly. He presented all the evidence he had collected, including the dying gunman's confession, the forged medical reports, and the suspicious financial transactions that linked Whitman to the conspiracy. His clear presentation of facts began to turn more townspeople against the businessman's propaganda. Dr. Harrison, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, stepped forward to publicly admit his role in the cover-up. The physician's confession sent shockwaves through the crowd as he detailed how Whitman had threatened his family unless he falsified the autopsy reports. His tearful admission provided the credibility that Jake's evidence needed to convinced skeptical observers. Whitman realized his carefully constructed plan was collapsing and made a desperate decision that revealed his true character. He drew his gun and threatened to shoot the Apache girls himself, rather than allow them to testify against him. The businessman's mask of respectability fell away completely, exposing the ruthless killer beneath his civilized exterior. Jake reacted instantly to protect the innocent girls, drawing his own weapon in a lightning-fast motion that surprised everyone present. The two men faced each other in a classic Western standoff, while the crowd scattered for safety. Years of law enforcement experience had prepared Jake for this moment, when justice would be decided by skill and courage. The gunfight erupted with explosive violence as Whitman's hired killers opened fire on Jake's outnumbered supporters. Bullets whined through the air and splintered wooden buildings while men dove for cover behind water troughs and hitching posts. The peaceful town of Copper Creek became a battlefield where the future of justice hung in the balance. Jake's superior marksmanship and tactical knowledge proved decisive in the chaotic gunfight. He systematically eliminated Whitman's hired guns while protecting civilians caught in the crossfire. His deputy and loyal supporters provided crucial backup, turning the tide against the corruption that had infected their community. Edgar Whitman made a final desperate attempt to escape justice by taking one of the Apache girls hostage. He dragged her from the jail cell and held a gun to her head while demanding safe passage out of town. The businessman's cowardly act disgusted even his former supporters, who began to understand the depths of his evil nature. The hostage situation required all of Jake's skills as a negotiator and marksman. He talked calmly to Whitman while maneuvering for a clear shot that would not endanger the innocent girl. The Apache teenager showed remarkable courage by remaining still and giving Jake the opportunity he needed to end the threat permanently. Jake's perfect shot eliminated Whitman without harming his hostage, bringing the conspiracy to a violent but just conclusion. The businessman's death ended his plans for land seizure and genocide, while saving 2 innocent lives and preserving justice in the territory. The crowd erupted in cheers as they realized the corruption had been defeated. The aftermath of the gunfight revealed the full scope of Whitman's criminal enterprise. Hidden documents showed his connections to territorial officials and military commanders, who had been prepared to authorize Apache removal based on his fabricated evidence. The conspiracy reached far beyond Copper Creek and could have resulted in widespread genocide. Judge Wilson, captured during his attempted escape, provided additional testimony about the corruption network in exchange for leniency. His revelations led to investigations of other officials who had been compromised by Whitman's bribes and threats. The cleanup of territorial government would take months to complete fully. The Apache girls were officially released and their innocence proclaimed throughout the territory. Their dignified behavior during the crisis impressed many white settlers, who began to reconsider their prejudices against native peoples. The incident became a catalyst for improved relations between the communities. Jake's heroic stand against corruption earned him recognition from territorial authorities and respect from honest citizens throughout the region. However, the marshal took no pleasure in the violence that had been necessary to preserve justice. He had seen too much death and corruption to celebrate victory without mourning the cost. As peace returned to Copper Creek, Jake reflected on the thin line between civilization and savagery. The real savages had been the white men willing to murder innocents for profit, while the supposed savages had shown dignity and courage in the face of injustice. The irony was not lost on the experienced lawman who had risked everything to protect the truth. 3 weeks after the gunfight that shook Copper Creek to its foundations, Marshal Jake Thompson sat in his office reviewing the territorial government's response to his detailed reports. The conspiracy's exposure had triggered investigations across Arizona territory, revealing a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of territorial administration. Several officials faced criminal charges while others resigned in disgrace. The Apache girls, now free and cleared of all charges, had become unlikely symbols of justice triumphing over prejudice. Their story spread throughout the territory, carried by newspaper reporters and traveling merchants who recognized the significance of their vindication. Many white settlers began questioning their assumptions about Apache character and intentions. Jake received visitors daily as word of his heroic stand spread across the frontier. Fellow lawmen, Territorial officials and ordinary citizens came to hear first-hand accounts of how one man's courage had prevented a tragic miscarriage of justice. However, Jake remained humble about his role, insisting he had simply done his duty as a peace officer. The investigation into Whitman's conspiracy revealed disturbing connections to Eastern business interests that viewed the frontier as an opportunity for unlimited exploitation. Railroad companies and mining corporations had been quietly funding schemes to remove Apache from valuable lands. The poisoning plot was just one example of systematic efforts to justify genocide through manufactured crises. Dr. Harrison's cooperation with authorities helped expose the medical fraud that had nearly condemned 2 innocent girls. The physician's detailed testimony revealed how easily scientific evidence could be manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. His experience served as a warning about the dangers of corruption within trusted institutions. The territorial government implemented new procedures to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. All land acquisition deals involving Indian territory would require multiple approvals and independent verification of claims about hostile activity. The reforms were named the Copper Creek Protocols in honor of the town where corruption had been decisively defeated. Jake's relationship with the local Apache band strengthened as tribal leaders recognized his commitment to justice regardless of race. The marshal learned basic Apache phrases and customs, building bridges between communities that had been artificially divided by men like Whitman. His efforts created a model for peaceful coexistence that other regions began to emulate. The 2 Apache girls, whose names were Yellowbird and Morning Star, visited Jake regularly to express their gratitude and maintain the friendship forged during their ordeal. Through an interpreter, they shared stories of Apache culture and traditions that challenged stereotypes promoted by men seeking to justify conquest. Their gentle wisdom impressed everyone who met them. Yellowbird proved particularly gifted with medicinal plants and began working with Dr. Harrison to combine Apache healing knowledge with modern medical practices. Her expertise saved several lives during a fever outbreak that struck Copper Creek later that year. The collaboration demonstrated how different cultures could benefit from mutual respect and cooperation. Morning Star showed artistic talents that captivated the town's children and adults alike. Her intricate beadwork and storytelling ability broke down barriers between Apache and white communities. Local women began learning Apache crafts while teaching their own skills in return, creating lasting bonds between former enemies. Jake's investigation had revealed that Whitman owned significant debts to Eastern creditors who had pressured him to acquire Apache lands quickly. The businessman's desperation had driven him to increasingly extreme measures, culminating in the murder plot that ultimately destroyed him. His story served as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of greed and desperation. The territorial capital sent a special prosecutor to handle the remaining legal proceedings against Whitman's surviving accomplices. Several hired gunmen faced murder charges, while corrupt officials confronted fraud and conspiracy accusations. The trials would continue for months, but justice seemed certain to prevail in most cases. Copper Creek itself began to prosper, as news of Jake's heroic stand attracted honest settlers and businesses. The town's reputation for justice and fair treatment drew Apache traders who had previously avoided white settlements. The increased commerce benefited everyone while proving that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. Jake received offers from larger towns seeking experienced lawmen who could be trusted to uphold justice without corruption. However, the marshal chose to remain in Copper Creek where his work had made the most difference. He felt a responsibility to continue building the peaceful community that had emerged from the crisis. The marshal established regular meetings between Apache leaders and town officials to address problems before they escalated into violence. These diplomatic sessions prevented several potential conflicts and created mechanisms for peaceful resolution of disputes. Other territories began requesting copies of the Copper Creek agreements to implement similar programs. 1 year after the events that transformed Copper Creek, Marshal Jake Thompson stood on the same dusty street where he had once faced down Edgar Whitman's conspiracy. The town had grown considerably, with new businesses and families attracted by its reputation for justice and peaceful coexistence between different communities. The gallows that had nearly claimed 2 innocent lives had been dismantled and replaced with a school, where Apache and white children learned together. Yellowbird and Morning Star had become respected members of the community, their integration serving as proof that prejudice could be overcome through understanding and mutual respect. Yellowbird's medical practice combined traditional Apache healing with modern techniques, while Morning Star's artistic work decorated many homes and businesses throughout the territory. Their success inspired other Apache families to establish peaceful relationships with white settlements. The territorial government had completed its investigation into the corruption network that Whitman had assembled. More than 20 officials faced criminal charges, while new laws prevented similar conspiracies from developing in the future. The Copper Creek Protocols had been adopted territory-wide, creating standardized procedures for land disputes and requiring independent verification of all claims involving Indian conflicts. Jake received a letter from the territorial governor commending his courage and requesting his assistance in training other lawmen. The marshal had become a symbol of integrity in law enforcement, and his methods were being studied throughout the frontier. However, Jake remained focused on his duties in Copper Creek, where his presence continued to maintain the delicate peace between communities. Dr. Harrison had rebuilt his reputation through honest medical practice and collaboration with Apache healers. His experience with Whitman's corruption had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of scientific integrity. The physician now served as a bridge between white and Apache medical traditions, creating innovative treatments that benefited both communities. The Apache band that had nearly lost 2 of their young women to false justice had established a permanent settlement near Copper Creek. Their presence brought valuable trading opportunities and cultural exchange that enriched the entire region. The tribal elders worked closely with town officials to resolve disputes and maintain harmony between different ways of life. Jake's deputy had been promoted to sheriff of the neighboring county, carrying forward the lessons learned during the Whitman crisis. The former deputy's commitment to justice over prejudice had been forged during those dangerous days when corruption threatened to destroy innocent lives. His success demonstrated how individual courage could create lasting change throughout the territory. The newspaper accounts of Jake's heroic stand had reached eastern cities, where they challenged romantic notions about frontier violence and Indian conflicts. Writers and journalists began visiting Copper Creek to document the successful cooperation between Apache and white communities. Their stories spread a new narrative about the possibilities for peaceful coexistence on the frontier. Morning Star had married a young Apache warrior in a ceremony attended by both Apache and white residents of Copper Creek. The wedding celebration featured traditional Apache customs, alongside frontier traditions, creating a unique cultural blend that symbolized the community's evolution. The event demonstrated how integration could preserve cultural identity while building new connections. Yellowbird had established a medical school that trained both Apache and white students in combined healing techniques. Her innovative approach attracted attention from medical professionals throughout the territory, who came to study the integration of traditional and modern practices. The school became a model for cultural cooperation that other regions sought to replicate. Jake had quietly married the town's school teacher, a widow who shared his commitment to justice and education. Their wedding was a simple affair that reflected their practical natures and dedication to community service. The marshal's personal happiness provided a fitting conclusion to the struggles he had endured while fighting corruption and prejudice. The conspiracy that had nearly destroyed 2 innocent lives had ultimately strengthened the bonds between different communities in Copper Creek. The shared experience of confronting evil and choosing justice had created lasting friendships that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. The town had become proof that the frontier could be a place of cooperation rather than conflict. As Jake walked through the bustling streets of Copper Creek, he reflected on how dramatically things had changed since that terrible morning when 2 Apache girls faced execution for crimes they did not commit. The courage to stand against popular opinion and powerful interests had saved innocent lives and created a better future for everyone in the community. The desert wind carried the sounds of children playing together regardless of their heritage, Apache and white families conducting business in the market, and the general prosperity that came from peaceful cooperation. Jake Thompson had done more than save 2 lives. He had helped create a model for the kind of society that the American frontier could become when justice triumphed over prejudice and greed. The desert rider had indeed revealed the savage truth behind the Western scheme, but he had also shown that civilization's highest ideals could flourish, even in the harshest environments when good people chose to stand together against corruption and hatred.